Betrayed, frustrated, and angry. That is how one Israeli cabinet member describes the feelings of his government following the United States' intentional inaction at the UN. This is Special Report. Good evening and welcome to Washington. I'm Doug McKelway in for Brett Baer. The relationship with the United States' closest ally in the Middle East has not been a simple one the last 8 years. As the Obama administration winds down, Israelis believe the United States played a key role in orchestrating one last parting shot. And they say they can prove it. Correspondent Kevin Corke is in Honolulu, Hawaii with the president. Good evening, Kevin.
Hey, good evening to you, Doug. You're right. It is a stunning accusation, one that the Israelis say the incoming Trump administration will be fully briefed on. Clear evidence. That's what Israeli officials say they have that proves the Obama administration was, in fact, behind the controversial UN Security Council resolution vote condemning the Jewish state.
We have rather ironclad information from sources in both the Arab world and internationally that this was a deliberate push by the United States, and in fact they helped create the resolution in the first place.
That resolution demanded Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The U.S. abstained, which allowed for the measure's passage in the international body. That abstention seen not only as a break with U.S. tradition, but by some as an act of revenge, directed at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose frosty relationship with President Obama went into the deep freeze during the run-up to the Iran nuclear deal, when the Jewish leader bypassed the White House to defiantly address a joint session of Congress.
Well, I think he was just trying to get even. Look, he called me into the Oval Office before the election, and he said to me, Alan, I want your support, and I have to tell you, I will always have Israel's back. I didn't realize what he meant is that he would have his back to stab them in the back, and he just stabbed them in the back.
I wouldn't say surprised, disappointed in the volume of the reaction, because I think it fails to acknowledge the totality of this president's record.
Obama administration officials strongly reject suggestions that the U.S. was behind the vote or has turned its back on the Jewish state. Principal Deputy White House Press Secretary Eric Schultz saying in a statement, President Obama has done more for Israel and its security than any previous U.S. president, before adding, we cannot have a two-state solution be a slogan while the trend lines on the ground are making a two-state solution less likely. A direct reference to the continued expansion of Israeli settlements, seen as a historic protective buffer by many, but as an unlawful incursion by opponents.
The conflict today isn't about homes, it isn't about Jews living on this side of a line or on that side of a line. It goes to the very heart of whether or not there is room in the Middle East for one Jewish state.
Even as the Israeli controversy swirls, President Obama remains convinced of his own political power, telling CNN if it were legal for him to run for a third term in 2016, he would have won.
I'm confident that if I had run again and articulated it, I think I could have mobilized a majority of the American people to rally behind it.
Now, you had to figure this was certainly not going to get past President-elect Donald Trump, and right on cue, Doug, as you can well imagine, he had a comment about what the president just said right there in that interview, that exit interview with CNN. Let me just share part of what he said about it. He said, listen, President Obama said what he thinks he would have won against me, and then he goes on to say, he should say that, but I say, no way. Jobs leaving, ISIS, O'Care, etc. Now, to be frank, I think it's a fairly measured response by the president-elect, but nonetheless, it's sharp enough to remind everybody just not only what was at stake in this election, but how competitive he might have been against even President Obama if it were possible. Doug?
Indeed. Kevin Corke in Honolulu tonight. Thank you, Kevin. For more now on the tense relations between the White House and Israel, Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, joins me here in studio. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming in. Good to see you.
Good to be with you, Doug. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
And Happy Hanukkah to you. The Obama administration has said that it was not behind this UN Security Council resolution to condemn Israel for its West Bank settlements. And Mr. Schultz, Eric Schultz, the Deputy White House Press Secretary, said, and I'm quoting now, the U.S. did not draft this resolution, nor did the U.S. Introduced this resolution. The Egyptians, in partnership with the Palestinians, are the ones who began circulating an earlier draft of the resolutions. The Egyptians are the ones who moved it forward on Friday, and we took the position that we did when it was put to a vote. But the spokesman for your boss, Prime Minister Netanyahu, had a very, very different opinion. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We have rather ironclad information from sources in both the Arab world and internationally that this was a deliberate push by the United States, and in fact they helped create the resolution in the first place. And so it's deeply disappointing that this has been the path of President Obama.
So what is the evidence you have?
Well, we have that evidence, and as I said earlier, we're going to present it to the new administration, and if they choose to share it with the American people, that'll be their choice. But we have evidence. What David said is only part of what we have, and it's very clear that the U.S. orchestrated that. And look, had they even said up front, this is our policy and this is what we want to do, we would be in the same place, because ultimately we have to deal with a resolution that's on the table and its long-term consequences for Israel. And this is a very, very bad UN resolution. You know, when Hamas and Islamic Jihad, two terror organizations that are committed to Israel's destruction, are celebrating the passage of a UN resolution, that's not a resolution that the United States of America should abstain on. That's a resolution that they should veto.
Don't you think, though, that the American people and the Israeli people should have a right to know whether our administration here in this country, our present administration, is lying to us about the origins of this resolution?
Well, I'm going to let the future administration decide on that. Look, we are very pleased and deeply appreciate the fact that President-elect Trump was very clear that this resolution should be vetoed. We appreciate very much that there was bipartisan support in Congress. Both Democrats and Republicans, their leaders came out suggesting and basically asking President Obama to veto this resolution. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and now we have to deal with the consequences, and we're looking forward to working with the incoming administration and the Congress to figure out how we can mitigate the dangers of this resolution, at the very least, if not repeal it.
The Jerusalem Post is reporting tonight, in the aftermath of your telling in other interviews that you're going to reveal this information to the incoming administration, quoting, let's not quote, let me paraphrase it. The J-Post is reporting tonight that Vice President Joe Biden intervened with Ukraine to get them to vote for this resolution. They are one of the non-permanent members of the Security Council. Is that true?
Well, that's what a minister in our government heard directly. But
is that the evidence you're...
No, the evidence we have is much greater than that, and it's pretty clear. It's 100%. I've been with the Prime Minister of Israel for 15 years in one capacity or another. He doesn't make such a statement without clear evidence, and as I said, we'll present that evidence to the new administration.
I want to go through the timeline of this resolution to an extent, because earlier in last week, Egypt withdrew the resolution, apparently under pressure from Prime Minister Netanyahu and also pressure from President-elect Donald Trump after you had met with Trump in Trump Tower. Do you think that President Obama's manipulations here were revenge?
Listen, I hope not. I think that President Obama has a certain policy towards settlements. He's expressed that many times. He expressed it in 2009 when he first came into office. So this is not a new issue. What is new about this is that it's been taken to the Security Council. That has not happened since the days of Jimmy Carter. And it's an old story that the UN gangs up on Israel. It's a new story that the United States is not opposing that gang up, but what really upset us more than anything else is to find out that the administration was sort of orchestrating it. And again, Doug, what are the consequences of this resolution? This is a resolution that says that the Western Wall is occupied Palestinian territory. That's against, I assume, U.S. policy. This is a resolution that says that the settlements are all illegal. That's against U.S. policy. Just last week, the State Department spokesman said that's not our policy. We call them illegitimate. We think they're not constructive to peace. This is a resolution that basically encourages boycotts and sanctions against Israel. That's against the U.S. policy. So you have a series of things where you have a resolution that's not just against Israel, it's against stated American policy. And the president himself went to the UN in September 2011, and he said these issues should not be resolved in the UN Security Council. They should be negotiated between the parties. We agree with President Obama in 2011. Unfortunately, in 2016, December 2016, it was a different story.
Nevertheless, I think a lot of Americans have trouble understanding why this is so damaging from your perspective, given the fact that we have this new administration coming in, which is very, very favorable to Israeli interests, given some of their appointments. We're talking about Nikki Haley as the new UN ambassador, who's been very much opposed to the BDS movement. We also have David Friedman, the new ambassador to Israel, who is a hard right-winger. He wants to move the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem.
Well, I think I have no doubt that the new administration will strongly back Israel. But understand, once you pass something to the UN Security Council, it is very hard to reverse, and it is seen in many quarters to be international law. I think that the Security Council resolution is actually against U.S. law, but that's a different story. We're very concerned with what could potentially happen with this resolution if we don't work with the new administration and Congress to, like I said, mitigate its effects or ultimately overturn it. And one more thing that's very important. This is very, very bad for peace. Because in order for Israel to negotiate a lasting peace with our Palestinian neighbors, we have one card to bring to the negotiating table, and that's territory. And everyone understands that if you have a future peace, there'll have to be some element of a territorial compromise. Well, the United States just failed to veto a resolution that basically says all that territory is Palestinian territory. So what card is Israel coming to the negotiating table? So in addition to all of these problems with this resolution, perhaps the biggest problem of all is that it undermines the prospects for advancing a peace, which we very much would hope to do with the new administration.
Last question, 10 seconds or less. There's already some movement on the Hill here to start removing some money from the United Nations, from Congress, which funds, I think, 22% of the United Nations operating budget. Your thoughts about that?
Well, we look forward to discussing that with the new administration and with Congress, and we think there has to be a real pushback against the UN, which has become a cesspool, not just of anti-Israel activity, but anti-American activity. And I think if you look at the entire UN, you look at all the programs in the UN, I think a new president in Congress that wants to make sure that every penny of your money is going to something that protects and defends and advances U.S. interests, I think there's a lot of changes that can happen at the United Nations.
Israeli Ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, thank you very much for coming in. Good to talk to you. And happy
Thank you
again. Well, with a new administration coming in this new year, there comes a chance for new relations with Israel, even as tensions seem to be ratcheting up to 2016 as 2016 comes to a close. Correspondent Peter Doocy is with the president-elect in Palm Beach, Florida tonight. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Doug. The president-elect is saying he thinks the UN just made it harder to negotiate Mideast peace, elaborating with a tweet late this afternoon that says this: the United Nations has such great potential, but right now it is just a club for people to get together, talk, and have a good time. So sad. This, as experts say, the 44th president is making life hard for the 45th president on purpose.
So the president has deliberately tied the hands of his successor. It's going to make it much harder for President Trump to bring about peace.
As the president-elect's foreign policy team surveys the damage done by the Obama administration's decision to let a UN resolution critical of Israel to pass, his domestic team is looking at federal courts across this country, where there are more than 100 judicial vacancies, about double what President Obama got to fill when he took office 8 years ago. Dozens of the open benches are referred to as judicial emergencies because they've been open for at least a year, so the incoming administration has a big opportunity to defend its upcoming initiatives on things like immigration, gun control, and abortion from Democratic challenges before they ever have a chance to rise to the Supreme Court, where there is also an opening for the next president to fill. Part of a tweet posted by counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, says that, quote, judges were sleeper election issue that energized base voters and helped tip undecideds in swing states. This weekend, another top Trump staffer, Jason Miller, said he won't take the job of White House Communications Director that he had been given 2 days earlier. Quote, this is not the right time to start a new job as demanding as White House Communications Director. My wife and I are also excited about the arrival of our second daughter in January, and I need to put them in front of my career. The Trump campaign has not yet offered any other comment or provided any context addressing Mr. Miller's sudden and surprising announcement. Senior advisor Stephen Miller, no relation, has just been tapped to author the inauguration address the next president will deliver on January 20th.
We're going to have to secure the southern border.
Miller occasionally opened for candidate Trump on the trail and is a well-known advocate for stricter immigration policies who used to work in Senator Jeff Sessions' office. The 31-year-old also helped the president-elect refine his campaign pitches on the trail, including the convention keynote known for its dramatic tone. But as the inauguration approaches, there is still talk about the campaign. Mr. Trump tweeted late Friday that, quote, Vladimir Putin said today about Hillary and Dems, in my opinion, it is humiliating. One must be able to lose with dignity. So true. This comment shows the friendlier side of the Trump-Putin relationship, but Trump allies suggest he is ready to be tough on the Russian president, too.
This is the same Donald Trump the liberals were terrified was going to sell out to Putin, who's now pivoted and said, look, as to quote General Mattis, we can be your best friend or we can be your worst enemy.
Over the weekend, the president-elect and his family got a standing ovation when they walked into a midnight mass near Mar-a-Lago. And even though it was a quiet start to this week, the day after Christmas, we're told Mr. Trump is going to resume with staff meetings tomorrow at Mar-a-Lago, and he'll have a full schedule come Wednesday down here in Florida. Doug?
Peter Ducey in Palm Beach tonight. Thank you, Peter. In less than a month, President-elect Trump will be here in Washington to take the oath of office. In an effort to mitigate fears of conflicts of interest, Trump says he is shutting down a foundation that bears his name. Correspondent Rich Edson explains why it might not be so simple.
The president-elect says he is closing his charity. The New York State Attorney General says he's not. President-elect Donald Trump says he is dissolving the Donald J. Trump Foundation to avoid conflicts of interest when he assumes the presidency next month. In a statement, he says, quote, "I am very proud of the money that has been raised for many organizations in need. I don't want to allow good work to be associated with a possible conflict of interest." New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman's office says it is still investigating the Trump Foundation and, as a result, says the president-elect cannot legally dissolve his foundation until the investigation is finished.
It's been mired in some controversy as well, and it probably is smartest just to shut it down as he goes in the Oval Office. And that's what Donald Trump wants to do. We'll see what the New York State Attorney General has to say about that, but we know his intent now.
In October, Schneiderman ordered the Trump Foundation to halt its fundraising because he says it failed to register with the State Charities Bureau and provide audited financial reports. The Washington Post has reported the foundation spent charity money to settle lawsuits for Trump's private businesses and buy a $20,000 painting of himself and give a $25,000 gift to a campaign committee supporting Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. In a statement, the Democratic National Committee says, quote, "The Trump Foundation has served as a slush fund for Trump to bribe elected officials, attack his political enemies, and buy portraits of himself." The Trump transition team has pointed out Schneiderman endorsed Hillary Clinton for president, and Trump's allies complain the Attorney General is using his office politically to damage the once Republican nominee and current president-elect. The president-elect says he will also separate his business interests from his presidency. His transition team said earlier this month he was going to detail how. They now say Mr. Trump will do so next month before the inauguration. Doug?
Thank you, Rich. The Republican National Committee was forced to defend a Christmas message that read in part, quote, "Just as the three wise men did on that night, this Christmas heralds a time to celebrate the good news of a new king." Well, critics, including some Republicans, took to social media to question whether that reference to a new king was about President-elect Donald Trump. RNC spokesman and future Trump press secretary Sean Spicer defended the statement, tweeting, quote, "Christ is the king. He was born today so we could be saved. It's sad and disappointing you are politicizing such a holy day." Coming up next, the search is on for wreckage of a Russian military plane that was bound for Syria. But first, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 32 in Chicago, where Christmas weekend turned violent. Police say 11 men were killed, with at least 32 others wounded in shootings across the Windy City. Last year, a total of 30 people were shot in Chicago over the holiday weekend, leaving 6 dead. Fox 17 in Nashville, where police are searching for 4 inmates on the run after escaping through a hole behind a jail toilet. County officials say 6 inmates initially escaped on Christmas morning, but 2 have already been apprehended. Police say the men are considered dangerous to the public. And this is a live look at Phoenix from Fox 10, just 2 hours north drive there. People are digging out after being hit with a winter storm that dropped 14 inches of snow in the Flagstaff area. At one point over the weekend, Interstate 40 was closed in both directions, and some motorists were trapped in their cars overnight. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. Turkish authorities have formally arrested more than 1,600 people in the last 6 months for supporting terrorist organizations or insulting officials on social media. At least 10,000 more are being investigated. A state of emergency following a failed coup in July, detaining thousands of citizens and purging tens of thousands of public servants and journalists over alleged ties to outlawed groups. Critics have expressed concerns that the crackdown has targeted political opponents and critics, not just terror threats. The search is on as thousands are scouring the Black Sea for the wreckage of a Russian military plane that was carrying 92 people, all of whom are presumed dead now. Reporter Kitty Logan has the latest on the search and investigation. Hello, Kitty.
Russian investigators are still looking into what caused the crash, and to do that they need to find crucial evidence. The Russian Defense Ministry says its search teams found 2 parts of the plane, and specialist divers recovered 11 bodies. It's a huge effort, 3,500 people involved in that operation off the coast of the Russian town of Sochi. There are 45 ships searching the water. Recovery workers are also using helicopters, drones and submarines. Wreckage is scattered over a large area, making the search much more difficult, and there's still no sign of those crucial black boxes. The Russian transport minister says there's no reason to think the plane was brought down deliberately.
We think that the reason for the crash could be a technical fault or a pilot error. But I repeat, it will be clarified by the investigation of the Ministry of Defense Special Technical Commission.
The Soviet-era military jet crashed just 2 minutes after taking off from Sochi on Christmas Day. The crew didn't report any technical problems. One possible theory is poor fuel quality could have been a factor. Russian President Vladimir Putin declared an official day of mourning for all 92 people who died in the crash. 60 of those on board were members of a famous military choir, and people have been paying tribute outside their Moscow base, laying flowers and lighting candles. The band had been heading to Syria to perform for Russian troops at a key airbase there. Recovery teams say they've now finished searching the surface of the sea, but finding the wreckage underwater may take some time. Doug?
Kitty Logan in London tonight. Thank you, Kitty. Colombian aviation authorities have announced that the plane crash that killed 71 people last November was caused by the aircraft running out of fuel. The evidence points to human error rather than technical problems or sabotage. The plane was put into a holding pattern because another flight had reported a suspected fuel leak and was given priority. In a recording, the pilot can be heard repeatedly requesting permission to land due to a lack of fuel and a total electric failure. Senator, presidential candidate, and Secretary of State are just 3 of the titles John Kerry has earned in his career. The man has been a staple in Washington, and Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen looks at how one big deal could loom very large for determining Secretary Kerry's legacy.
From the day that those talks began, we were crystal clear that we would not accept anything less than a good deal.
And how good of a deal you think the Iran nuclear accord is likely determines how good of a Secretary of State you think John Kerry was. 5 other world powers signed on, including Russia and China, but Kerry was the driving force through 2 years of negotiations, and his legacy largely rests on the deal's success going forward.
We now have a deal in place, and it is being implemented by all sides, that will preclude Iran from ever achieving nuclear weapons capability.
In exchange for curbs on its nuclear program, Iran received tens of billions in sanctions relief, sometimes in massive infusions of cash. Critics charge the deal should have forced Iran to dismantle its nuclear program, not preserve it, that some military sites have been closed off to UN inspectors, and that the deal has actually strengthened the leading state sponsor of terrorism.
What Kerry did not have is a kind of a sound strategic judgment. Of course, Iranian nuclear program was a serious challenge to the United States. But if you would talk to Gulf states, to the Saudis, they would tell you. But they were even more concerned about Iran getting billions of dollars once the sanctions are lifted, and being able to use these billions of dollars for all kinds of military buildup and subversion in the Gulf.
And with Iran aggressively testing ballistic missiles, harassing U.S. warships, even seizing American sailors at gunpoint, Kerry's own spokesman admitted the nuclear diplomacy may have emboldened the regime.
But you can't rule out that, in fact, this deal has served as a cause for this more aggressive posture.
I mean, I can't rule that out.
The other major foreign policy issue of Kerry's tenure, Syria's civil war, with its death toll exceeding 400,000, its displacement of 6 million others, its obliteration of whole cities, Kerry inherited. He doggedly pursued diplomacy with Russia without success.
He would be the first to tell you that he's obviously frustrated by where we are in Syria, and that our diplomatic efforts have not been successful.
The flood of foreign fighters to Syria, the establishment of a caliphate there and in Iraq by ISIS, the large-scale intervention in the conflict by Russia and Iran, propping up Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. In all this, critics point to the president's infamous failure in 2013 to enforce his own red line against Assad for using chemical weapons. Before the president backed down, Kerry had invested his own stature in a defense of imminent airstrikes.
And history would judge us all extraordinarily harshly if we turned a blind eye to a dictator's wanton use of weapons of mass destruction.
And when the president decided instead to seek congressional authorization for strikes that never came, as the U.S. and Russia hastily hatched a plan to evacuate Syria's declared stockpile of chemical weapons, Kerry's face telegraphed his own incredulity. Elsewhere, he tried and failed, like many before him, to broker a deal in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, carried out President Obama's restoration of diplomatic ties with Cuba, absent any reforms by the Castro regime, and shepherded to completion the Paris Climate Accords, a subject Kerry equated in significance to terrorism.
It's hard for some people to grasp it, but what you are doing here right now is of equal importance because it has the ability to literally save life on the planet itself.
You got a friend.
Yet Kerry's response to terrorism, as when he brought folk rock legend James Taylor to sing for Paris after the Charlie Hebdo attack, sometimes earned the Secretary of State ridicule.
I'm sorry, that was adolescent foreign policy. It was embarrassing. What John Kerry has done over and over again is try to match his diplomatic efforts to the delusional narratives coming out of the White House. And there's been this terrible disconnect with reality, with things on the ground. Thus, the endless talks over Syria that have gone nowhere, where we end up watching the horror in Aleppo right now.
Even Kerry's harshest critics told us he will be remembered as a decent man and a tireless public servant. Of course, his legacy will also include his 3 decades representing Massachusetts in the U.S. Senate, his decorated Navy service in Vietnam, and his campaign against that war upon his return home. Doug?
Thank you, James. China's first aircraft carrier, along with an additional 5 warships, sailed into the contested South China Sea today. China's defense ministry called the movement part of a routine open sea exercise. Well, Christmas may be over, but the holiday shopping season not done yet. Consumers all over the country have been spending holiday cash, gift cards, and returning those less than stellar gifts. Correspondent Rob Schmidt is in the thick of it in New York City tonight. Good evening, Rob.
And Doug, good evening. One of the most iconic stores you can think of, the Macy's here in Herald Square in Midtown Manhattan. And it is a very busy night here, one of the busiest days of the shopping season for this store. People have been pouring in here, people looking for discounts, those after Christmas sales, also looking to make those returns. There are so many billions of dollars in returns that happen every year. Clothing, the #1 most returned item. That's the gamble if you want to buy the gift of clothing. It might go back. They say the National Retail Federation says nearly 40% of clothing gifts are returned. That's more than things that are bought online, which is at a rate of about 30%. And as you see behind me here, Macy's just packed with people tonight. It opened early today, staying open until 11 o'clock tonight. We spoke with shoppers today, including a man who was searching for a deal on a diamond for his wife.
This is our post-Christmas shopping. We're going to here, hopefully get some good bargains when we're in there, see something that she likes.
We're trying to find a winter coat, so unfortunately they didn't have the one we want, so now we're going to more stores.
I am actually waiting for the after Christmas specials here, and I'm looking forward to it. So we came from Washington, D.C., we arrived today, and we look forward for the next few days of shopping.
Everybody loves to shop. Holiday sales projected to be healthy this year, but not as big of a piece of the pie as in the past. The National Retail Federation projecting $655 billion in November and December retail sales, up about 4% from last year. Online sales, they say, will be about $117 billion. That keeps growing, those online sales. These are, of course, projections. We're going to have to wait for the final numbers in January. We did speak to a market track analyst, though, this afternoon, who says there's a reason the holidays seem to start earlier and earlier every year, and the reason probably won't surprise you.
The thought is that the early bird gets the shopper in a lot of cases, and if they offer compelling deals early in the season, then they can take that demand out of the market sooner and capture that shopper dollar before the other retailers do start to get their deals in front of them.
Well, the holiday shopping season not as impactful as it has been in the past. November and December making up about 21% of annual retail sales. That used to be closer to 25%. People now shopping all year long. Everybody wants a bargain. People kind of figure that you're not going to get the best deals when they know everybody's shopping, so they're looking to get that shopping done a little earlier in the year. Gift cards, the big hot thing lately. The second biggest gift given is a gift card, and it's smart because nobody's going to return a gift card. You can't get the wrong size. Doug, back to you.
But they do let them expire on occasion. Rob, thank you very much. Rob Schmidt in a very busy Manhattan tonight. Tributes are pouring in for British singer George Michael, who died over the weekend at the age of 53. Fans set up memorials at his home in England, where he died of an apparent heart failure. Michael rocketed to stardom as part of the pop duo Wham! And later developed a long and celebrated solo career. Former Beatle Paul McCartney posted a statement praising Michael's, quote, sweet soul music, which he said will live on. Besides music, George quietly gave millions of dollars to charities involved with helping children, cancer victims, and AIDS sufferers. Coming up next, the All-Star panel stops by to analyze the state of U.S.-Israeli relations following the anti-settlement vote by the United Nations.
When we see the facts on the ground, again, deep into the West Bank, beyond the separation barrier, we feel compelled to speak up against those actions.
As I told John Kerry on Thursday, friends don't take friends to the Security Council.
This is a day where the international community have utterly rejected the settlement activities, the policies of dictation, the policies of apartheid being employed by the current Israeli government.
In the election, it's the most undemocratic thing a president can do, to tie the hands of his successor.
Thank God in 25 days we will see a change in the American administration and also a change in American policy.
A significant international crisis erupted on Friday when most Americans were paying attention to the holidays, when the United States, in an unprecedented move, decided to abstain on a UN Security Council vote, a resolution that would condemn Israel for its settlements in the West Bank. It is a vote that will have lasting consequences, or will it? Let's bring in our panel now. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard; Mara Liasson, national political correspondent of National Public Radio; Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist; and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. How much damage is done as a result of this?
This is very serious damage, and it cannot be undone because you can't change Security Council resolution without the acquiescence of the Russians and the Chinese, and you're not going to get it. But the Ben Rhodes statement you showed is so disingenuous. First of all, the idea that the Israelis didn't have a hand in this, the resolution shows up and they decide to abstain, is ridiculous. Does anybody think that Venezuela and New Zealand spent nights slaving over the wording of this resolution? They were the ones who introduced it. Of course not. This was a U.S. operation all the way. And the problem is, if Rhodes is right, this was only about the settlements deep in the West Bank, way beyond the separation barrier. You can understand the vote, perhaps. But it's not. Every Israeli, left to right, has agreed that when there's a settlement, those settlements, in other words, when there's a peace, are going to be abandoned and torn down. Avigdor Lieberman, who is the right-wing Minister of Foreign Affairs, lives in one of these settlements. He has said openly to journalists, I know it's so because I was in the room, that he would, and he lives in one of these settlements, that he would gladly evacuate and tear it down in return for peace. So there's no argument about that. But there are two other categories of settlements. The other are the close-in blocks near Israeli territory. Everybody agrees on all sides that in the event of a peace, they will go to Israel and Israel will give back in a land swap some of its territory to make the Palestinians whole. The pernicious part of this is the inclusion in the resolution of the term East Jerusalem. That was totally unnecessary, and it's completely illogical. It turns the holiest site in Judaism, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, into foreign territory. That's, people say it's the third holiest shrine in Islam. It's the first holiest shrine of Judaism. It's as if the UN passed a resolution declaring Mecca and Medina to be sovereign Jewish or Christian territory. It's absurd. It's an insult to the intelligence of the world, and is supremely damaging to the Israeli claim to its own holy places.
Molly, you just heard Charles say this. You heard Ambassador Dermer earlier in the program say that the United States was directly behind this, and that Israel has direct evidence, or words to that effect, that the United States is behind it, something that the United States government, the Obama administration, is vehemently denying. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it actually isn't that important, because what we know is that this happened, and the U.S. could have stopped it if the U.S. wanted to stop it. You have the U.S. Engaged in some pretty breathtaking, the Obama administration engaged in some pretty breathtaking dishonesty. They're saying that they warned Israel that this could happen, that they couldn't do anything to stop it. In many ways, this is Israel's fault. The U.S. had every incentive to keep this from happening, and they had the ability to keep it from happening. So whether or not there's this other information is kind of irrelevant. We know that the U.S. wanted it to happen because they allowed it to happen. And this causes huge problems for all sorts of relations with Israel. It goes against U.S. policy. We've never before said that settlements are illegal, as this policy does. It makes things very difficult going forward. We've gotten 25 years of concessions from Israel on the condition that we would never allow something like this to happen. I mean, this is a major mistake by the Obama administration.
Merle, what are the practical effects of all this?
Well, I think actually they might be not as bad for Israel as people think, because the Trump administration has a completely different idea about what to do going forward. Donald Trump has nominated an ambassador who's not for a two-state solution, at least that's what he said. And we know that Donald Trump says he wants to make this deal in the Middle East, but maybe the U.S. policy on Israel will be completely different, and maybe, as people are talking about in Israel today, that Netanyahu himself is going to have to decide whether he is for or against a two-state solution, which he has paid lip service to, but people don't know if he's really for that.
Steve?
Well, I think there are 2 points to make here. One looking backward, one looking forward. The first is about the Obama administration. I mean, this fits the pattern of the Obama administration, punishing American allies and accommodating American enemies. At the exact same time that this controversy was unfolding, we posted a piece on the Weekly Standard website about new revelations in the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration had sought to keep quiet. They were revealed in part in this piece that we posted on the Weekly Standard website by the IAEA, new documents showing that the Obama administration had given special accommodations to Iran as it pursues its nuclear program. This is the way that the administration has happened. I mean, it sort of perfectly encapsulates the administration's approach to the region, I would argue. And the second point, looking forward, is about the United Nations. I mean, I think this has the real potential to be a breaking point for the UN. This is the kind of thing that will bring together center-right coalition of, isolationists, non-interventionists, like Donald Trump sounds like he will be, along with conservative internationalists who have just had it with the United Nations. You look back at the history of the United Nations, it's a history of presiding over genocides, accommodating authoritarians, excusing dictators. You think back to the oil for food scandal under Saddam Hussein. Kofi Annan went into that scandal and said, we can do business with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And in fact, they did do business with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. This is what the United Nations has become, and its obsession with Israel, I think, is emblematic of a broader misplace of its priorities.
To that point, Ted Cruz tweeted, I think on Christmas Eve, quote, spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu tonight to wish him happy Hanukkah and assure him of strong support in Congress. No U.S. dollars for UN until reversed. Charles, what do you make of that? And what kind of a movement do you see building in Congress or in a new Trump administration to start pulling money from the United Nations?
Well, most Americans are not aware of the fact that we pay about a quarter of the freight of the UN. So we're paying
22%, something like that.
We're paying an organization that spends half its time, more than half its time, and energy and resources and bureaucracy trying to attack the only Jewish state on the planet, a tiny little speck, while genocide, mayhem, murder, terrorism is going on all over the world. It's an obsession that to an outside observer appears to be insane. Why are we doing this? And the rest of the time is spent undermining the United States and democracy and our allies around the world. It is an organization that exacerbates tensions. It does not assuage them. It was born in hope. The end of the Second World War, it turned out to be a disaster. Any move to minimize our support for it, any move to get it out of the U.S. Imagine if headquarters were in Zimbabwe, the amount of weight and coverage it would get. It would be zero. I think that's good real estate in downtown New York City, and Trump ought to find a way to put his name on it and turn it into condos.
On that note, next up, the panel breaks down the latest on the Trump transition.